We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour as people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
In celebration.
In celebration.
In celebration.
Of the life we share together.
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 We share together.
We share together.
We share together.
Yes.
As you all, I am absolutely certain, are well aware, we are a year into this pandemic. It was a year ago that we closed down operations of the church, and much of our daily living seemed to close down very suddenly as this pandemic became real and moving through this world. It's been a year where all our superlatives have lost their force of meaning. A year that showed us that we aren't terribly skilled at assessing risk. A year that asked us to overturn nearly every social grace we have learned to depend on. The visible smiles, the hug, the dinner out with friends, and 100 other moments of grace that we perhaps took for granted before, but don't take for granted anymore. And we have been confronted with more ambiguity, more unknowing, more learning and unlearning than most of us have ever had to deal with in our entire lives. As our planet made its orbit around our steadfast star, we, perhaps, were forced to confront absolute grief. Recently, I have begun an encounter with a thin book of theology by an elder in the United Methodist Church named John Tucker. Now, the book itself is thin, which is nice for theology, but the theology is not thin. The theology is compelling and challenging. And Tucker begins his narrative by reminding me of the Hans Christian Andersen story of The Princess and the Pea. You remember that one? The story is about this prince who wanted to marry a princess, but she would have to be a real princess. Now, I know it's really unclear what exactly the prince means by a real princess, but apparently his worldwide search for realness and princesses had been unsuccessful. In any case, a young woman shows up and the prince's mother, the queen, devises a test to see if she is the real deal. So she puts a pea on the bedstead and then piles 20 mattresses on top of that pea, and then 20 eider-down beds on top of the mattresses. And on this, the young woman would sleep for the night, on the notion that only a real princess would be sensitive enough to feel the pea under all that bedding. In the morning, she was asked how she slept, and she replied, "Very badly. It seemed like I was lying on something very small and hard, and it kept me awake all night." And this apparently was the only proof they needed. As Andersen writes, nobody but a real princess could be as sensitive as that. So, okay, ew. To our modern ears, this story is full of, well, let's just say that most of us would disagree with its overall messaging. But in John Tucker's take, the story has a new possibility. Tucker names the P. Tucker identifies the P as grief. He writes, each of us lives on mattresses piled on top of that P. Some of us try to ignore the P. Some of us try to feel its presence more acutely than others, but it is there for all of us. This grief, as he says, is the P. Grief, he writes, is how human beings respond to change, to loss, or deprivation. Change, loss, deprivation. Well, I'm pretty sure that everyone has experienced these at various times in our lives. I am absolutely sure that we have all been acutely aware of change, loss, and deprivation in the past 12 months. So John Tucker offers us two ways of thinking about grief, and I would encourage us to consider these as two sort of endpoints on a continuum. And on one end, there is what he calls circumstantial grief. Now, circumstantial grief is responding to and reflecting the physical, relational, emotional necessities of life, what he calls our circumstantial needs. And we could use hours of time listing all the circumstantial needs that we have lost, been deprived of, or have changed in the last year. We've lost our sense of generalized safety around other people. We were, at least early on, deprived of an abundance of toilet paper. We changed how we worship as a religious community. And as the pandemic wore on, we lost friends and loved ones to this disease. So whether it be the need for toilet paper or the need for relationship to a loved one or the need for community, when these are lost, when these change, when we are deprived of them, these are the circumstantial needs, in Tucker's language, the circumstantial needs that circumstantial grief is a response to and a reflection of. So that's one end of the continuum. On the other end is what Tucker refers to as our absolute need. Now, our absolute need is to make peace with our mortality, with our vulnerability, our powerlessness. In other words, into the face of the fact that you, that I, that we are all sometime going to die, that we are mortal, our absolute need is to make peace with that, not try to deny or ignore or pretend it isn't going to happen. Tucker notes this. He says, absolute grief is what one experiences when one confronts absolute need. And anxiety is what one experiences when one tries to avoid it. Regardless of circumstances, all human people are capable of experiencing that existential angst that arises when we are confronted with that loneliness, that emptiness, that mortality, and the possibility of meaninglessness. And in this year of pandemic, most of us have touched that very, very absolute grief. Not merely or only our circumstantial griefs. I think it has been impossible to avoid absolute grief. My confession, for much of this year, I've been muttering to myself and sometimes to others out loud this phrase. I keep saying, we are all going to die. It started out as a kind of snarky, defensive gallows humor against the bleakness of the lockdowns, the restrictions, the fears, the ever-rising death toll. It arose when confronting first the sudden emptiness of the lockdown and continued through the culture wars of mask wearing and social distancing. And I admit this dark humor is one of my emotional self-defense mechanisms. It's a way I have learned maybe even cultivated, to avoid confronting my absolute grief, to avoid confronting my mortality, my loneliness, and the possibility of meaninglessness. In a way, we are all going to die became kind of a mantra for me this year. And like all mantras, its meaning began to unfold over repetition and time. And so that phrase, we are all going to die, has morphed from a snarky, dark humor to a kind of wonderment and awe, and unavoidable and absolute truth. I am finite. I am finite in all the ways that are meaningful to me. So here I must confront that absolute grief rising from that finitude. And if we can do so with courage and compassion and not denial, then I am that we are entering into a certain kind of life, an authentic and free, liberated religious life. In his book, Tucker argues that many, what he calls believers, many believers, in this case, he's referencing mostly a Western Christian sense of being a believer. This is his tradition, that believers often rest their beliefs on denying the finality of the grave because they cannot imagine living peacefully with the absolute grief risked by such acceptance. Because they cannot imagine living peacefully with the absolute grief risked by such acceptance. And I'm kind of with him in that. It's hard to imagine if I accept my mortality, it doesn't feel like I could live peacefully with that. But this is shifting in me, because as I delve into this book and understand a little bit more and confront my own mortality, this whole project of living a religious life is not to deny our mortality. The project of living a religious life is to find peace and compassion, courage, and even awe and wonder in that absolute grief. It is living a certain kind of life, a life that emerges when we commit to the possibility of transformation, not in spite of or in denial of our mortality, but because of it. A certain kind of life that we here at Mill Creek might call an awakened to love kind of life. Awake because we feel that little pea of absolute grief under all those mattresses and are taking each mattress off one by one to confront its source. Friends, we have been living our lives sleeping on 20 mattresses and 20 eider-down bed covers, trying hard not to feel that little pea, that absolute grief of our living. I get it. It's existentially terrifying. But confronting that grief is perhaps the most liberating thing we can do. Confronting that absolute grief is what makes it possible for us to live authentic, vulnerable, and honest lives. Friends, I do believe, I do know there is a way to live peacefully with that grief. At Mill Creek, here at this church, we invite one another into that peacefulness, right when we invite you and ourselves to awaken to love. Amen, my friends. And I love you. And may we live in blessing.